Hello, welcome to CISI TV. I'm delighted to welcome here today my old and dear friend Moorad Choudhry. Moorad is a chartered fellow of our institute, an esteemed banker, a great guy all round, the first editor of our review of financial markets. He throws great parties when he launches new books, and the last one was a few months ago at the Reform Club, of which he's a proud member, to launch the second edition of his latest book, The Principles of Banking. You'll see this rather better on your screen just now. There will be a link as to how to buy this really excellent tome, and it's far more readable than it might look. And I've got my properly read copy next door. But Moorad, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. With your bass guitar, we're not going to talk about why you've got a bass guitar there. We'll do that in a later program. But this is one of the first in a series we're doing of relatively short programs on CISI TV to talk about some of the major issues affecting our industry. And your industry, Moorad, plainly is banking. Now, we sit here in the days after Credit Suisse went through some terrible wobblies and a week or so after Silicon Valley Bank went bust. Is this, do you think, a banking crisis or a crisis involving a few banks, including those two which we've named, which I think is allowed by the libel laws? Moorad, welcome, and thank you for doing this.
No, my pleasure. Thank you, George. We do indeed go back many years. Thank you for your very kind words. You're always far too kind. My pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'll answer that question with a simple no. I don't think it's a banking crisis as such. But yes, quite right. It's all in the public domain. Silicon Valley Bank, I personally think was down to their own misunderstanding or unfamiliarity with basic principles of balance sheet management in banking, asset liability management. And it's clear when one reads all the information that is out there in the press that they didn't understand two particular risk exposure types, interest rate risk and liquidity risk. And I think they made a cardinal error in assuming that interest rates, which had stayed close to zero, and yield curves that had stayed flat for a very long time, more than 10 years, I think they'd made an error in thinking that it would carry on staying like that. So, of course, when the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, their bond portfolio started going underwater. But I don't think even then they had an excuse for making that assumption, because 40 odd years earlier, in the early 80s, the savings and loan industry, the savings and loan sector in the US, they came underwater when the Federal Reserve raised rates much more aggressively than over the last 12 months. And their business model became unstuck because they were doing long dated fixed rate lending funded by very instant access deposits. So they didn't have any precedent to call on, but I don't think the executive and the board at Silicon Valley Bank had such an excuse. So that's with them. With Credit Suisse, it seems to have been a more steady buildup of one bad news item after another, whether it was in their investment banking arm or in their wealth management arm. And it seems to be that the sentiment, the reputation just went against them. I'm not entirely convinced they were completely insolvent or illiquid, but I guess the Swiss government didn't want to hang around to find out. Does that mean we're going through a banking crisis? Not at all. These are firm-specific issues here, certainly for those two firms. So that's why I started off by answering no to your first question.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I did hear someone the other day, a week or so back, talking about the Credit Suisse problem as being a black swan, but it strikes me it was not. It was quite the opposite of a black swan, in the sense that people could see it coming. It was not a horrible incident like, for instance, 9/11, which caused its own problems.
Well, absolutely, yes. Again, if I take the original definition of black swan, it's a very rare, it's a very low probability, high impact event, isn't it? It's statistically meant to come along very rarely, and it's unexpected, and it's a very high impact event. That's my understanding of a black swan. Maybe I've got that wrong. I mean, Credit Suisse has been in the news for the wrong reasons over the last, say, 12, 24 months. There was the big loss they suffered because of misunderstandings or not simply managing their counterparty risk with a hedge fund that failed, Archegos. They had an exposure to a greensill capital that also cost shareholder value a lot. They have seem to have had a drip of bad news, negative news affecting them over the last couple of years. So and there was that to call on, but their credit default swap price, which shows the market's view on them as a default risk, spiked up in the week or two before they were bought by UBS. Now, why did that happen? I guess there was some sentiment in the market that one can't quite put one's finger on, but it was negative. Now, how does one manage a loss of reputation like that? That's the question here. With Silicon Valley Bank, it's old-fashioned asset liability management, which they just didn't get right. With Credit Suisse, it's a learning point there for us, especially for large banks that might think they're safe because they've got a fortress balance sheet, a robust balance sheet. But if one loses one's reputation, either steadily over time or a very short space of time, how does one respond to that? How does one manage that and get out of it? That's a lesson learned there, I think, for large as well as small banks.
Something which also arose during this recent crisis of banks, and you're right, I'm sure that it's about banks rather than banking, was how suddenly cryptocurrencies and the whole crypto market suddenly came alive again. I've been a terrible, well, I think an appropriately hawkish person about cryptocurrencies. My children would say old-fashioned about cryptocurrencies and really out of touch and so on. But just recently, it looks like they could be a solution to a problem rather than a solution in search of a problem. Do you think there's more the better legs under cryptos these days?
No, you're asking the wrong person here, George. I wasn't entirely convinced of crypto, or certainly Bitcoin back in when it came out with 2008, 2009. I wasn't entirely convinced of it then, and nothing has happened since then that's made me become anything less skeptical then. In fact, if anything, I'm beginning to think it's a bit of a con all round, where certain individuals profit, but a larger number of individuals lose out. It's a high volatile asset class. I mean, there's nothing behind the asset, but it's a high volatile in terms of price movement asset class, which does seem to have benefited from a flight to quality, which is it seems a bit of an oxymoron. Flight to quality because of these bank wobbles. There is a certain class of person that might think, well, the banks are going bust, I'll put it all into Bitcoin. But the reason Bitcoin started coming off when the Fed started raising rates was because suddenly there's no longer a cheap funding option like there might have been for other asset classes. So we saw that come off, and then there seems to have been an upside on it because of bank crashes. Now there is a certain class of person that is beginning to think, well, I can't trust the banks. That's probably in a minority, and they may well think, well, crypto is the answer. The only question I would ask, I mean, I've never gone anywhere near it, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but that's just a personal view. The only question I would ask someone who is, very keen on any kind of crypto, whether it's Ethereum or Bitcoin or any of them, or any kind of token or coin that you get out there, I would ask them this. Let's just say we did do away with dollars. We didn't have fiat currency, we didn't have dollars, and it was all in crypto. How would you value it? Show me how you'd value it. At the moment, it's valued in terms of dollars, isn't it? The Bitcoin price goes up and down because of a dollar equivalent. Let's just say no one was taking dollars anymore. No, there was no fiat currency. So a car might cost £20,000, or maybe that's a cheap car, I don't know. Or a loaf of bread might cost a couple of pounds. How many Bitcoins would it be when you don't have a reference to the fiat currency? That's what I would ask. So I don't think it's a reprieve for them. I remain skeptical, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But I don't want to get any loads of aggravation from, because they're quite religious in their zeal for crypto, the people who are into it. So I must emphasize this is a personal opinion, and I respect all views.
£20,000 a cheap car. It's a few years since I bought a new car, but I suspect £20,000 these days, with inflation running as it is, probably is a cheap.
Probably is, but my point. I mean, whatever the price of anything is, I mean, this diary cost me about 30 odd pounds from The Economist or something. Now, how would I price it in Bitcoin if there weren't any pounds sterling to equivalent? This is my point. How do you value it when you don't have a reference of fiat currency? No one's been able to answer that question for me.
We've spoken a lot about risk. Possibly the classic, wonderful example of very bad risk management, way beyond Silicon Valley Bank, was the terrific interview on the WeBox on YouTube and so on recently with the chief risk officer of FTX, who seemed to be wonderfully, completely clueless, which was amusing but disastrous for that exchange, if it was indeed an exchange. But on a more serious note, where do you see the real risks in the banking system now? What do you see the growing risks and maybe some of the risks that are going down a bit?
That's a really good question, and we'd need a good long time to chat about that one. First of all, the risk that never goes away is good old-fashioned balance sheet risk, which is what undid Silicon Valley Bank. That never goes away. We can't forget the traditional principles of banking, which have held good for 500 odd years. Modern banking dates from the 15th century. So that remains a risk and needs to be taken seriously and managed by boards. The other risks we see all around us in the state of the economy. We see geopolitical risks which banks have got to understand. There is a lot of regulatory enthusiasm for addressing climate change risks, so banks have to take that on board. There is also competition risk because people are expecting different things. Different parts of the customer franchise are expecting different things from their bank. So when one looks at newer banks, challenger banks, digital banks, that fintech side, they offer, or are beginning to offer, depending on which country you're looking at, they're beginning to offer services other than just the straightforward banking service. It becomes a lifestyle app that one has on the phone that doesn't just offer banking services. That may be a challenge for more traditional or long-established banks. There is increasing competition. There is uncertainty in the economy. At least we have interest rates back at a level that makes them more conventional, which does enable banks to generate P&L in a more straightforward manner than when interest rates were near to zero. So the risks are both external and internal. There is competition, there's new technologies, there is technology risk. Every time one takes on a new technology, there's, of course, an added dimension of cyber risk that the bank has to manage. We've seen how banks have come unstuck with transformation projects, with installing new IT systems. There's always fraud risk, external customer fraud. If I was to show you a risk register for a bank today in 2023 compared to, say, 20 years ago, or when I started in the city, which was in the last century, that list has got longer and longer all the time. The number of items on a risk register in a bank's risk management framework, a large number of items. It's many and varied, and banks have got to be on top of all of these, and that's a real challenge for boards and executives. They've got to take it really seriously.
Do you think the size of risk registers causes a problem with people actually understanding what the main risks are? In other words, one has seen in many instances, I'm sure many of our members have seen either in their own firms or in other organizations in which they're on the boards, risk registers running to dozens or even the hundreds of Excel pages of interesting things to look at, with some painted in red and some amber and green and so on. But are they just too big? Are we spending too little time focusing on the big nasties?
I mean, I should add that to my list of challenges, because it is an art to be able to deliver the right information of risk exposures and mitigation at the board and the executive level in a way that is instantly accessible, in a way that is both succinct, but all the right information and instantly accessible. I mean, I must admit, depending on, you look at banks are many and varied in themselves. You get different types of institutions in every country, but it wouldn't be the case that every board of every bank, every member on that board, or every senior on the exco, the executive committee, understands the nature of all the risks. So it's a challenge to be able to present the information in a way they understand, and that's ongoing. Banks should always review the way they present their management information to boards, but it's still incumbent on all these individuals to be able to understand this. If an individual at the senior exec level or non-exec level in a bank isn't completely au fait or familiar and understanding of the sensitivity of their institution to changes in market factors, whether it's something conventional like interest rates or something more new like the latest cybercrime issue, if they're not completely au fait about how their institution is going to be impacted by changes in external factors, then they're not up to speed. That they need to get up to speed on that, and that's a real challenge. It's not just getting the information presented in a way that's succinct and accessible. It's also themselves going out of their way proactively to understand the sensitivity of their institution to all these different types of risk exposures that they face.
Thanks, Moorad. Now, I'm going to recommend at the very end of this program that people go out and get your book, because it really is tremendous.
You're very kind. Thank you.
In their office. But something that I know the story behind this, but could you perhaps explain why? Then, and we'll put the image of the book cover on the screen right now. There are some terrific contributors here, people like Sharon Bowles, Baroness Bowles of Berkhamsted, Helen Sachdev from Loughborough Building Society. But at the very top of the list on the front cover is Neal Ardley of Solihull Moors Football Club, whom I've been privileged to meet with you at the Reform Club in London. Can you just give us end the program with an explanation of that, please?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a very good question. Now, you're quite right. All the people who are at the forwards are people I've worked with personally in various different institutions, financial institutions over many years now. Now, Neal Ardley, I was always a Wimbledon fan. As a youngster, I was a Wimbledon fan. When he was a player, when they were in the Premiership, I remember thinking, great player, great guy, midfielder, fantastic fellow. I never met him. Then he became the manager of AFC Wimbledon, where he stayed for a good long time, about 6 odd years. He got them into League One from League Two, actually. And I met him quite a few times, and he's just an absolute top fellow, just a great guy, very genuine, very open, very real, really understands football. In fact, I got him in to present to an offsite exco when I was at a bank a few years ago, and he presented on leadership and team building. So remembering him as someone who I think is an exemplary team leader and leader, I thought, well, get him to write a forward about just not banking, because he's a football player or a football manager, but talk about leadership and team building, because I think what he said to me about that was exceptional. He's a great team leader. I've seen it in action on the football pitch. So I asked him, and he very kindly supplied the forward. So there you go. And because his surname begins with A, he's at the top of the list. But it was great to have his name on the front cover.
Indeed, and he was a wonderful man to meet. I guess we should disclose, for full disclosure, that both you and Simon Culhane, our former chief executive, are shareholders in AFC Wimbledon.
No. Well, every fan, every fan is a member of the Dons Trust, is an owner of the club. So quite right. Yes, I remember Simon. Yes, he was a Wimbledon fan as well. Yes, that's right. Recently retired as CEO of the institute. Yes, of course. Yes, we don't get too many of us around, but I do remember Simon being a Wimbledon fan.
Moorad, this is fascinating. I suspect there are people watching now thinking, are they going to talk about football for the next half hour? But we're not. I want to thank you very much indeed for
Sadly.
being on the program.
No, it's my pleasure. You're very kind. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us today. Tremendous.
All the best. Bye-bye.